The first thing I'm going to do with our new camshaft, which is a factory Mopar camshaft, is clean it off with some brake cleaner. Next, I hung the camshaft for my engine hoist using the bolt that we're going to use to install it. Now we're going to coat all of the shiny surfaces with engine assembly grease. You could overdo it, but you'd really have to use a lot. Make sure you get a good amount on each surface all the way around. Double check, make sure all the shiny surfaces are covered. This grease will dissolve in engine oil in time. Let's put some assembly grease on this front bearing where we insert the camshaft. Let's insert our new camshaft. Slowly and carefully. There we go. Brand new camshaft. Next, let's get some of our assembly grease on the end of the camshaft, and then we're going to reinstall the thrust plate. These T40 torque screws are tightened to 18 foot-pounds. Using a putty knife and some brake cleaner, as well as a plastic scraper, we're going to remove the old gasket material and any oil and debris left over on the mating surface for the gasket for the timing cover. Then we'll install our new timing gears and timing chain. Then our new gasket. Careful not to damage the oil pan seal that makes up the bottom half of the timing cover. Wipe the top of the oil pan seal, which also forms the seal for the bottom of the timing cover, with a solvent-soaked rag until it is very clean. For my final wipe down of the seal and mating surface, I'm going to use a microfiber because it doesn't have any lint on it, soaked in brake cleaner. Make sure you get the corners where we're going to put more RTV sealant on it nice and clean so that the RTV sticks. The only place we'll use RTV sealant on reinstallation are the corners, the areas where the timing cover gasket meets the oil pan seal. Let's clean the old gasket material off of the timing cover. Try and do this with a plastic scraper. Might have to use metal though. Yeah, definitely going to have to use metal. Or maybe you'll just peel it off. Be careful if you're going to use anything steel on aluminum, like this putty knife on this timing cover. Pretty easy to scratch it, we really don't want to do that. Most of it will just flake off with your fingers. Alright, let's get that wet with some brake cleaner. That should soften it up. There we go. Yeah, brake cleaner helps. Wipe off the inside of the cover, make sure it's nice and clean. Then we'll remove our crankshaft seal. About 25 minutes of scraping and cleaning later, we have a clean timing cover. We're going to use a flathead screwdriver and a hammer to drive the seal out. You'll almost certainly knock the little spring out first. That keeps tension around the crankshaft. Going to go around the edge. And just slowly work around the very outer edge, being careful not to damage the mating surface, and it'll pop out eventually. There we go. clean off the lip where we're going to install the new seal with a little bit of brake cleaner on a lint-free rag. Now, put a little bit of gray RTV around the outside of the new front crank seal. And then now you're going to want to find a large socket or suitably sized flat object to drive that in. I'm actually going to use a receiver for a ball joint press. Make sure you get it perfectly straight. Few more taps. Wipe off some excess here so we can see what we're doing. There we go, fully seated. Reinstall your timing chain guide back into the cover. Now let's install our new timing gears and timing chain. Install the timing chain on the camshaft and crankshaft sprockets. Make sure the two timing marks are lined up, because if they're not lined up here, then they won't be lined up on the motor. Let's install our new camshaft and crankshaft gears. Make sure that the two timing marks are correctly aligned. It looks like we're going to need to tap that on a little bit. So I'm going to use a large deep well socket to do that. There we go. If you're having trouble getting everything to line up, you can just take the chain off of the crankshaft sprocket, hold it together like that, and you can use the camshaft gear like a wrench. Install it part way. That allows you to rotate the camshaft in order to make everything align. So let's get those lined up. You can see the two timing marks are in correct alignment. Sometimes it takes several tries to get everything lined up just perfect. And we need to change this just a bit. There we go. I had to pull the crankshaft sprocket just a bit further off of the block in order to get everything lined up correctly. So now, take the time to make sure that this alignment is perfect. This determines your engine's timing. So I want to get it dead on accurate. If you compare the old harmonic balancer to a new one side by side, you'll notice that the old one has this little shining ring worn into the surface where it meets the crankshaft seal. Because of that, if you're going to use the old harmonic balancer for installation, you should install a sleeve over it. Or, in our case, we're just going to install a new harmonic balancer because, hey, if you're in a motor this deep, you may as well. Because installing the timing cover involves doing a couple of things in rapid succession, I would recommend at this point in time that you lay your fasteners and the tools out that you're going to need. You'll need an inch-pounds torque wrench, capable of torque values between 60 inch-pounds and 192 inch-pounds. You'll also need a harmonic balancer installer, because you do not want to use a hammer when installing the harmonic balancer onto the crankshaft. You can bump it gently, but any amount of force could damage the bearings deep inside the block, and we're not doing the bottom end today. You'll need gray or black high temperature RTV sealant. Use a little bit of engine oil to lubricate the inside of the front crankshaft seal. That way the harmonic balancer isn't spinning in it dry the first time we fire up the engine after we're done. Install some black high temperature RTV along just the corners where the block meets the oil pan seal. Some gaskets use RTV on both sides when you install the timing cover. We're going to use a Felpro gasket today, and it does not require any RTV on the gasket itself, only these two corners. Let's get our gasket. Careful your timing chain guide doesn't fall out. And we'll use a couple of bolts to hold that on while we install it. Let's use our big ones. Now we need to tuck the bottom edge of the timing cover into the oil pan seal. It can be a little bit tricky sometimes. Helps if you kind of pull the bottom of the seal out with your finger a little bit. Now, because the harmonic balancer itself, when we install it, is what actually centers the timing cover to prevent uneven pressure on the front crank seal, which would result in wear and leaking, we're going to finger tighten these bolts, install the harmonic balancer, and then torque them to spec. Then use an awl to center the gasket on this lower bolt. There we are. Do the same on the bottom right corner. That one's pretty close, but let's just be safe. Perfect. Let's put all of our 3/8 inch bolts in. Five-eighths inch up on top, just like on the bottom left. And now that we have all of those in loosely, let's install the 4 11mm oil pan bolts on the bottom. These 4 bolts effectively pull the bottom of the timing cover down to where it makes a seal with the oil pan and oil pan seal. Now let's install a harmonic balancer. Line up the keyed section and then push, but don't pound it on. That's enough to hold it. Now we'll screw in our harmonic balancer installation tool right into the end of the crankshaft. So we'll use this tool to draw the harmonic balancer onto the end of the crankshaft. This particular tool is operated with a 14mm wrench on the end and just a big crescent wrench to work the jack nut. It's really important that you don't use a hammer to install this because you could damage the bearings in the block. You should feel it bottom out on the crankshaft when the harmonic balancer is fully installed. There we go. Now let's remove that. Now I need to go around the edge of the timing cover and finish tightening all those bolts. The smallest bolts, the 3/8 inch ones, go to 60 inch-pounds. The largest ones go to 192 inch-pounds. And then the oil pan bolts on the bottom go to 84 inch-pounds. Knowing the oil pan seal's propensity to leak, I'm going to tighten the 4 oil pan bolts before I tighten the rest. Put a little bit of RTV around the backside of the crankshaft bolt. Want that to seal very well. You're going to have to hold the harmonic balancer with the screwdriver pressed against the outside of the timing cover and then tighten this bolt to 80 foot-pounds. There we go. Tighten the 3/8 inch bolts to 60 inch-pounds. And then this one right here you'll have to get by hand. Get it snug, not too tight. Now, because I'm picky and I don't like things hanging out, I'm going to trim the excess gasket off with a razor blade. Now it's time for the fun part. Time to scrape all the old gasket material from the old head gasket off of the engine block. So I think our tactics for cleaning off the engine block are going to be scrape, vacuum, repeat. So here goes. In fact, let's start with vacuum. Now let's scrape. Probably going to have to use a real razor blade on this, but we'll do what we can with plastic. Actually works surprisingly well. Because of the debris that will inevitably fall into the water passages and the cylinders, we want to vacuum as much out as we can, but we're probably going to want to give this a good coolant flush as soon as we have the engine put back together. And scrape some more. Definitely going to have to use a real razor blade for some of these things. Isn't this fun? But it might be the most important task in the entire operation. After a few rounds of scraping and vacuuming, time to use some brake cleaner on a rag. Start wiping the surface off. Stay out of the cylinders. We're not cleaning inside the cylinders. I know it's very tempting to do so, but that built up carbon, even if you clean it, will be back in a few thousand miles at most. And it'll naturally break off and self-clean and just get expelled through the exhaust. So leave it alone. What's important here is not that the surface looks clean, it's that it feels clean. If it's smooth and there's no chemical residue left on it from the previous gasket or from oil or from coolant, then it will seal. So like these dark sections between the water jacket holes, those are okay. I'm not worried about those. But we need all this section that was shiny from the shop originally, which is where the gasket actually seals. Those need to be perfectly smooth, or pretty close. I think we have the deck of the engine block just about perfectly clean now. I think we're there. Now that we have everything smooth, clean, and prepped, it is time to drop our lifters into the holes in the block so that they can do their job with the push rods. You can see beneath the cylindrical passage into which the lifters go the shiny top of the first lobe of the camshaft. This is a hydraulic lifter. You can see the lower face, which is what rides on the camshaft, and then you can also see the oiling groove and the passageway where oil will fill the inside of the lifter and then pressurize it and come out the top. It'll then travel up through the push rod to lubricate the top of the valve train. What we're going to do next is get a nice thin coat of engine assembly grease all around the outside on the bottom face, and I'm going to leave the top mostly alone. We might get just a dab there where it contacts the push rod, but we don't want to clog that oil passage. So around and around we go. A little bit on the bottom face, that's a very important location for it. A little bit on the top, and just a teeny bit right in there. Then we'll use a magnet to hold it from the top, and we'll just drop it in the passageway. Number 2. Got to make sure you get them in perfectly straight. If they're catching, it's just because they're not straight. last lifter. There we go. Let's wipe off all that assembly lube that we got on the deck of the block when we installed the lifters. We'll need to make a couple rounds with brake cleaner and a lint-free cloth to make sure you have everything clean again. Next, before our final cleaning of the surface of the block before we install our head gasket, let's use a little bit of synthetic oil and get a couple drops around the perimeter of each piston. Make sure that those rings aren't dry. Then we'll use transmission fluid and wipe down the inside of each cylinder just to make sure that there's no dust or contaminants that have gotten there during our rebuild process. You can see each little dot of synthetic oil. That should coat the rings, or so my theory goes, so that when we start this up, the piston walls are well lubricated with oil. Next, we're going to use some transmission fluid on a clean lint-free towel and wipe down the cylinder walls. Make sure that they're clean but also lubricated at the same time. I'll do the ones where the pistons are down, and then I'll rotate the crankshaft and do the first and sixth cylinders. Now just rotate the crankshaft via the harmonic balancer. Put first and sixth all the way down. Now we're going to do our final cleaning of the block before installing the head gasket. Brake cleaner on a lint-free rag. Probably going to want to make several passes on this with several rags. It needs to be perfectly clean. Time to do the head gasket. Today we'll be using a Felpro multi-layer steel gasket, and that should help to retain the torque of the head so that we don't have to retorque the head bolts after a few miles. Let's do one more brake cleaner wipe of the deck before we install the head gasket, just to make sure it's clean. Better safe than sorry. I'm only going to handle the head gasket with gloved hands because I don't want to get any of the oils from my skin on it. Take a quick look and inspect it, make sure it looks good, which this one most certainly does. And usually they'll say up or top, but not always. This one is not labeled, but should only fit one way. Alright, time to put the head back on the head gasket. I had my local machine shop clean this up for me and do a valve job. Not too hard to do yourself, but a lot faster to have somebody else do it. And not real expensive, just a couple $100. Aha, look at that. That is beautiful. Let's spin this around so that it's oriented the correct way. Before we install the head, we need to install a freeze plug in the back of it. The surface has been nicely media blasted at the machine shop, but we're going to make sure that that's perfectly clean and make sure the freeze plug itself is clean. We'll just use a little brake cleaner on a lint-free cloth. And then I'm going to use black RTV because it's continuously rated to be exposed to both coolant and oil, as well as temperatures in excess of 400 degrees Fahrenheit. So it should be excellent in order to seal our freeze plug. Just going to put a very thin bead around the outside and then probably smooth it with my finger. I'm going to use a ball joint receiver cup to pound that in. You want to provide pressure around the outer rim, not in the middle. It's a bit counterintuitive.
There we go. That ought to stay put for the next 15 years. Perfect. Alright, so those will be our two attachment points for the hoist. Now before we lower that head back down onto the new head gasket, let's clean the underside, because we want this to mate perfectly on the first try. We'll just use a brake cleaner soak rag again. Now, before you lower the head on, take a couple of your old head bolts, cut the tops off, and slot them. And we're going to screw those into the block, and that'll help guide the head down as we lower it onto the block. Alright, lastly, before we lower the head, let's blow the underside off. I have my lovely wife Lion helping us. Come on down. Yep, nice and steady. Good pace, just like that. There we go. Thank you, Lion.
You're welcome.
Pull off our chains. Now let's remove our little guide screws that we made. Time to install new head bolts. We're going to use our old head bolts and diagram here to know which ones are bolts versus studs and where each one goes. Additionally, stud number 11, which is the front driver's side stud, we'll use a thread sealant on that because it does enter the water jacket of the head. First thing we'll do is clean off the head bolts with brake cleaner. Next, we're going to take some motor oil on a rag and lubricate just the threads of the bolts, not too heavily either, just enough so that we have an even coefficient of friction as we tighten them all down. So just like that. If you have any excess on it, and I'd say that's a little more than you need, wipe that off with the dry part of the rag. So it looks just about like that. Not dripping, but definitely moist with oil. Go ahead and oil all of the threads on the bolts except for one. We're going to save one of the longer studded bolts. That's going to be bolt number 11. That's the front driver's side bolt. Because this bolt penetrates the water jacket on the motor, we're going to need to keep these threads dry so that we can coat them in thread sealant. Lastly, if you want to be picky, and you do, take a Q-tip and get a little bit of engine oil underneath the head of each bolt, including the one that we're going to put thread sealant on. Let's go ahead and put our bolts in. That's bolt 12. That's a short one. Bolt 8 is behind that. That is a stud, small stud. Bolt 4 is a regular bolt. Bolt 1 is a regular bolt. Bolt 5 is a regular bolt. Bolt 9 has a short stud on top. And bolt 13 is a regular bolt as well, way back. Now bolt 14 is a lot harder if you're doing a Cherokee. I don't even know if they fit all the way taking them out in a Cherokee, but bolt 14 has a large stud way back. All the rest along the driver's side all look just like this. They're all long bolts with studs. And then I covered bolt 11. I covered bolt 11's hole, just so I remember to put thread sealant on it. Let's go ahead and get these all finger tight for now. Now for bolt number 11, there's my reminder. This one we used thread sealant on. This is Permatex high temperature thread sealant. Let's wipe that little corner off. Now it's time to begin our tightening sequence. Now I would recommend making your own drawing of the tightening sequence because it helps you understand what's going on. What we're doing is we're making spirals out from the middle of the head. That way we evenly distribute the torque across the head in layers. That keeps the head from warping as we tighten it down. If it warps, it won't have a good seal. So make yourself a little diagram, then keep it somewhere where you can see it as we go through the tightening sequence. Alright, so we start with bolt 1, which is right in the middle of the head on the passenger side, and we're going to tighten that to 22 foot-pounds. Just double check, 22. I'm actually going to set that to 23 because I'm on an extension, but 22 foot-pounds is the correct value. Alright, I'm going to go to bolt number 2, then to 3, and 4, and then 5, to 6, to 7, 8, to 9, 10, then our water jacket bolt, which is 11, 12, 13 in the back, 13 is back passenger side, and lastly number 14, tighten to 22 foot-pounds. There's your first layer of torque on the head. Now we're going to repeat the same sequence, but this time tightening to 45 foot-pounds. After that, we'll double check to make sure that each bolt is tightened to 45 foot-pounds. Bolt 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, that's our water jacket bolt, 12, 13, back passenger side, and 14, the hard one to get to, rear driver's side. All right, the next step is to double check to make sure each bolt is at 45 foot-pounds. So we're going to go and make one more round, same torque value, 13, and 14. All right, everything is now set at 45 foot-pounds. Now we're going to do our final layer of torque, this one to 110 foot-pounds, except the water jacket bolt only goes to 100 foot-pounds. For this last round of torque to 110 foot-pounds, I'm going to switch to a 1/2-inch drive torque wrench. Start at bolt number 1, number 2, Now for bolt 11, you need to adjust your torque wrench to 100 foot-pounds. So back that down to 100. Back up to 110. For bolt 12. Bolt 13. 110 foot-pounds. And last one, bolt 14, driver's side rear to 110 foot-pounds. All our head bolts are now tightened correctly. I think in honor of getting our head on and properly tightened, we should put some paint on it. While we do our painting of the head, I'm going to use the valve cover to cover the top of it. That way we don't get paint in our valve train. Now before we do that, let's get this thing cleaned. And like most things, I just use a little bit of simple green, toothbrush, and some elbow grease. Obviously, to get off 17 years of baked on oil and grease, it's going to take a couple of rounds. I've made about 2 passes on this so far, but it's coming off quite easily. Of course, I got some of the goop scraped off and it was still attached to the head. Oh yeah, I think about 2 more passes, that'll be clean. That looks pretty good to me. Let's let that dry in the sun, and I think I'll go do some masking. Anything we don't want covered in paint is covered in tape, aluminum foil, or old beach towels. Now let's set the valve cover on and paint the head. You can also see that I installed the old spark plugs. That'll keep paint out of the internals of the head.
Don't forget to wear one of these. "10 minutes, time for coat number 2. Third coat, last coat.
Here are our Harland Sharp roller rockers. They recommend that you soak these overnight in break-in oil, something that has a high zinc content. So we'll do that. Like pouring syrup on pancakes. We'll throw another half quart or so in there. All right, let's see our handiwork. Next, let's install our new block heater cord, since the last one got torched when I lost a zip tie. The block heater cord on a 4-liter goes on the back of the block on the driver's side, just plugs right in. Then you have to carefully zip tie it out of the way so that it doesn't contact anything hot while you're driving. If you don't zip tie the block heater cord well away from the exhaust manifold, it will end up like this. Let's pull these old spark plugs out of the head that we used to keep it sealed while we painted it, and put our new ones in. Before installing each spark plug, make sure you get a little bit of synthetic engine oil around the threads. Then using a standard 5/8 inch spark plug socket, install and tighten those to 27 foot-pounds of torque. Before we install our intake and exhaust manifolds, let's make sure we get those cleaned up. A little bit of simple green and some soap and water. And then for the intake manifold, you're probably going to need to use diesel fuel to get the inside of that clean. Using some brake cleaner on a clean lint-free cloth, let's wipe down the mating surface for the manifolds on the head. The reason I'm doing the manifolds before I do the rockers is because I don't want to drip any oil onto this mating surface. Let's make one more pass. We're going to use a new Felpro gasket for our intake and exhaust manifolds. I noticed our flange surface isn't quite clean, so we're going to use a steel brush and just gently clean any corrosion off of that. Want to make sure we still keep it flat though. Apparently Lego wants to play rope. Lego, do you want to play rope? Just a second, doggo. Bring it here. Good boy. That's better. It's got a nice gentle sheen, nice clean surface with not much corrosion on it. Alright, let's install our exhaust manifolds now. We're going to place them onto the stud on the back and the front, and then we'll install the middle bolt just finger tight. This is considered bolt number 3, and that'll hold them on. You almost need a third hand to do this. Make sure they're at an even height and fully covering the ports for the exhaust. Next, locate the 2 cylinder head dowels. There's one there and one right back there. We're going to install the intake manifold, and it indexes off of those 2 cylinder head dowels. Got to get our wiring harness back up out of the way. Find those cylinder head dowels. I'm going to get a flashlight to make sure that I get this seated correctly on the dowels. Now let's install our washers and fasteners. Just finger tight now. Before we tighten anything, we're going to make absolutely certain that the intake manifold is perfectly flush against the head and the new gasket. Otherwise, the first time you go to start up this engine, it's going to race and you're going to have to shut it off. Time to start untucking things from underneath the exhaust manifold. If you recall, that back engine stud is much easier to get to from underneath. That one's tough to get to. I have pretty small hands. I think if my hands were any bigger, I would need to use an extension to get there. With all the bolts finger tight, you'll notice there are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 bolts that secure the top of the manifolds. Now, just like your head gasket, there's a sequence that we need to tighten these in. So to make sure we get it right, I'm just going to take a piece of wire, you can use rope or string, drop it down right behind the center bolt in the top. The first bolt we tighten is underneath and to the right, so to the rear of that bolt. Tighten this bolt first, then tighten the bolt to the left of the blue wire, and go up top and tighten the top center bolt. Then we move to the left of the blue wire. That's going to be bolt number 2, also to 24 foot-pounds. Now we're going to tighten bolt number 4, which is essentially right underneath the fuel injector for cylinder number 2. And we'll do that using a foot-long extension and our 9/16 inch socket. Back underneath the Jeep to get to bolt number 5. Bolt number 5 you should be able to reach if you have a pretty low profile torque wrench with no extensions. Fastener number 6 is the nut that goes on the alignment stud in the front of the motor. This one gets torqued to 23 foot-pounds. Fastener number 7 is located at the very back of the exhaust manifold, almost to the firewall. That goes to 23 foot-pounds. Fastener number 8 is 1 bolt forward of the center bolt on top. That goes to 24 foot-pounds. Fastener number 9 is the first bolt that's on top of the series. It's just behind that front stud and above it. Unfortunately, you have to use a universal joint on this one, which is not ideal for establishing good torque figures, but it is what it is. 24 foot-pounds. The 1, 2, 3, 4th bolt back is our 10th fastener. That goes to 24 foot-pounds. That you can reach with just an extension and a wobbly. Finally, the very back fastener is our 11th fastener, and that one goes to 24 foot-pounds. Alright, the manifolds are on now. Starting to look like a Jeep again. I'd say now's as good a time as any to reinstall our engine coolant drain plug. That uses our special 5/16 inch National pipe thread square fitting. That's a hard one to find. And that is torqued to 25 foot-pounds. Alright, time to install the new roller rockers from Harland Sharp. Pull this valve cover back off, keeping things clean. Now we're going to install new push rods, but before we do that, we're going to check these for straightness by rolling them on a perfectly flat surface. Either a piece of glass, or in this case a piece of granite tile, that'll work. Yep, that one's straight. We're going to check all 12 and then drop them in the block. If you're reusing your old push rods, in addition to checking them for straightness, it's a good idea to sight down the inside towards a bright light and make sure that they're not clogged. Take each push rod that you've checked for straightness, wipe it off so that we know that it's clean. Get just a teeny bit of engine assembly lube on both ends of it. And then drop it down the hole and make sure that you have it centered on the top of the hydraulic lifter. Use a sufficiently bright light to make sure that it is centered in the top of the lifter. That one's good. Last one. They have a very distinct feel when they're seated correctly. You should still check each one, but you can tell by feel when they're correct. Alright, it is officially the fun part. Time to install roller rockers instead of the old factory stamped steel rockers. First step in installing roller rockers is to get a dab of engine assembly grease on top of each valve stem. Now, simply because we've got everything all clean, and I'd like to keep it that way, at least for a few days, I'll lay down a paper towel here so I don't drip too much oil over our intake manifold. Let's put our pedestal bases down. And then each cylinder has a pair of roller rockers that we're going to install. I'm going to insert each 1/4 inch hex socket bolt into each side of the roller rockers. These have been soaking in high zinc content flat tappet engine break-in oil for the last couple of days. These are 1/4-inch Allen bolts. We tighten each cap screw to 24 foot-pounds, but we do it in increments. So we'll turn about 1/8 of a turn there, 1/8 of a turn there, Incidentally, I have the first piston at top dead center. We're pretty close. Put our pedestals there. Take out another set of Harland Sharp roller rockers that have been soaking. Put our cap screws down through the bearing assembly into the pedestals. And make sure that the cups are seated on the end of the push rods. Get them started here with just an Allen key. Once we start feeling resistance, we'll use the 1/4 turn method. All right, last one. Put our pedestals down. All done. Harland Sharp roller rockers in a Jeep 4-liter. Before we install our valve cover gasket, we need to clean the top surface of the head so that it's oil-free and dry. Use brake cleaner and a lint-free rag. There's a theme here, because there's quite a bit of oil now on our roller rockers, but we'll make a couple passes and it'll be clean. If you look closely, you can see that 2 of our head bolts here and here have a stud on the top. That stud is designed to help keep the gasket in place. So we'll go ahead and apply our valve cover gasket. Now let's install our valve cover. Since our new Fel-Pro valve cover gasket came with new grommets for our valve cover bolts, let's go ahead and pop all the old ones out. Just use a long flat tip screwdriver. Go around the edge, and then use the screwdriver to remove the old rubber grommet from the washer. Just like that. Now let's wipe off the lower rim of the valve cover with a, you guessed it, brake cleaner soaked rag. Then we'll flip it over and wipe over the top. Give one more wipe to the lower surface of the valve cover. To install the new rubber grommets, just put the thin side down through the valve cover, and then press the metal washer or cap through it on top, just like that. There are 15 of these total, so just go around the edges and install all of those. Now we can put our valve cover on. Let's try to keep the underside of it oil free. That can be tricky. I'm going to kind of roll it on from the side. Excellent. Let's install the bolt for our valve cover. Back passenger is a stud. A regular bolt. A regular bolt. Next one is a stud with a little O-ring on it. Regular bolt, and regular bolt. On the driver's side, they're all regular bolts except for the very back one. That's a stud. Using an extension and a 7/16 inch socket, let's get those about finger tight all the way around. Then we're going to tighten them all with a torque wrench in a specific pattern to 77 inch-pounds, not foot-pounds. While we get these finger tight, don't get them so tight that it compresses the valve cover gasket at all. The very back side on the driver's side will either need a deep well socket or we'll actually make it finger tight. The first bolt you tighten is the fourth back from the front on the passenger side, and these all go to 77 inch-pounds. Put our little O-ring back on top. Then go across the valve cover to the fourth from the back on the driver's side. Tighten that to 77 inch-pounds. We're using a 7/16 inch deep well socket here. Then come forward and tighten this one. And across the valve cover passenger side, third from the front. The fifth from the front on the passenger side is your fifth bolt. Then across for bolt 6. Bolt number 8. Continue your spiral pattern around to the back here. Second from the back is bolt number 9. Second from the back on the driver's side is bolt number 10. Then the very front for bolt 11. Bolt number 12. Even though the factory service manual says there are 14 bolts around the top of the valve cover, there are in fact 15 on the late model TJ. So we will tighten this very back one last. Now let's put on the thermostat housing. I cleaned as much corrosion off as I could with a combination of a plastic scraper, toothbrush, and some simple green. Then now let's scrape the gasket surface. I'd like to do it with plastic, but you're probably going to need to use a razor blade. Just be careful and keep it flat so we don't gouge the aluminum with the steel blade. And we'll scrape the remainder of that gasket surface off. Now let's clean off the portion of the head where the new gasket's going to seat. Since the head's steel, it's just fine to use a razor blade. Still want to be careful, but you don't have to be nearly so careful as you would with anything made of aluminum. Then you're going to wipe that off with just a clean cloth that's damp with water. Water should be plenty. If you have a lot of corrosion on the surface, you may want to add a small layer of RTV. I would use black RTV when you put the gasket in place. This one's clean enough, I think we're fine without it. With our freshly cleaned mating surfaces on the head and the thermostat housing, let's install our gasket. I'm going to use a Felpro gasket. I've had good luck with them. And it goes on dry, as long as you have a good clean surface. The electrical connector goes kind of up and towards the driver's side of the vehicle. These half-inch bolts get torqued to 156 inch-pounds of torque. Since I still have my original upper and lower radiator hoses, I think we're just going to go ahead and replace those, since I don't plan on being back in here for quite a while. Take our clamp off. Let's see if we can wiggle this guy off the water pump. Make sure that's clean. Just replaced my water pump a couple years ago. Put our new one on. Don't forget to transfer the hose clamp. I've decided to go ahead and install a new heat shield after all, just to be safe. Make sure to fold these fingers down between the runners of the intake manifold. Let's cut the zip tie holding the harnesses up here, and then we'll reinstall our electrical rail and our fuel injector rail. The back of these rails go on the top of the little studs that secure the valve cover. And these go on the head bolts. Push those down all the way. Anytime you pull the fuel rail on a vehicle, it's a very good idea to replace the O-rings that seal your fuel injectors. Then we'll lubricate them with engine oil and reinstall our fuel injector rail. Now let's install our fuel rail. Yep, they're going in. Before plugging them in, let's clean out the other side of each electrical connector. Little electronics cleaner. Then push each electrical connector back into place and slide the red tab down to lock it. Third one's the tricky one. It's kind of underneath the fuel rail. Tighten the fuel rail to manifold bolts to 108 inch-pounds. In the very back of the valve cover is a nut that goes on the valve cover stud. That secures the bracket that holds the wiring harness. I don't have a torque value for that. Let's torque it just a little bit less tight than the valve cover bolts. Let's pull this wiring rail back into position. Insert the two 10mm socket bolts. And I don't have torque values on these, so we're going to torque these to about 100 inch-pounds. Remember, we're doing steel into aluminum here. Using a solvent-soaked rag, make sure the surface of the intake manifold, where the throttle body is going to mount, is clean. Might need to scrape it just a little bit with a razor blade. I'm going to use a plastic razor blade so that I don't do any damage to this surface, because the mating surface needs to be nice and clean and smooth. Wipe that off once more with a solvent-soaked rag. Then we'll put our new throttle body gasket on. If you haven't done so recently, now would be a good time to clean out the inside of your throttle body. So let's put our new gasket down. That is secured with 4 10mm bolts. And then we're going to torque those to 90 inch-pounds. Well, good morning, everybody. Let's put our exhaust back on. I'm going to have to jack the vehicle up to have enough clearance to get these in place. Now that I've wiggled my exhaust into place, which took a few minutes, let's bolt the catalytic converter onto the exhaust header. And there are 4 15mm bolts that attach those flanges. A little hard to get to, but they're doable. I'm going to use a 1-foot extension with a wobbly head attached to that 15mm socket. That'll give us enough reach to get these things started. There's just enough room to get a ratchet and a torque wrench up in here. Do a few turns on one side and then alternate back to the other side. Tighten these to 24 foot-pounds. Let's install our upstream oxygen sensors next. They both screw into the bases of the exhaust manifolds. Tighten the oxygen sensors to 20 foot-pounds. Lastly, let's install the 4th oxygen sensor. That would be downstream, bank 1. Now let's tighten the bolts that secure the catalytic converter to the muffler. Factory spec is 21 foot-pounds. I've learned mine comes loose if I don't get them to at least 35 or 40. Let's go ahead and lower the Jeep now that we're done working on the exhaust. Good. Moving up to the front of the engine, let's reinstall our fuel line to our fuel rail. So first we'll put the little connector here inside. Make sure it goes all the way inside the lip of the line on the driver's side. And make sure also before you do that there's a little O-ring. Make sure it is behind this as well. It should be there. Then I'm going to use a little bit of isopropyl rubbing alcohol. That'll help lubricate this so it goes in a little bit easier. I'm going to come around on the driver's side so I can get a little bit more leverage on this. These are pretty stiff. There we go. And let's get our bracket on that secures it. Let's come around to the passenger side of the vehicle. I'm going to remove the rag that's been keeping the bore clean that holds the oil pump drive assembly. Let's clean off the lower gear section of this and make sure it has a little bit of engine break-in lube in it, and then we'll install that. This is a brand new oil pump drive assembly. I've got probably 2,000 or 3,000 miles on it. When I replaced it, it was actually the second time I've replaced it. I've worn 2 of them out so far. So let's get a little engine assembly lube on that. That's a lot of engine assembly lube, but that's okay. Not going to hurt anything. Before we install the oil pump drive assembly, we're actually going to go ahead and fill the engine with oil and then use a screwdriver and insert it into the oil pump drive assembly bore and use that to turn the oil pump so we can get plenty of oil circulated throughout the motor. We'll use a special break-in oil that is much higher in zinc additive, among others, to reduce sliding friction. That way all the new parts will mate together correctly. Let's get the seal of our oil filter wet with fresh engine oil. Install the new oil filter. If you look down into the bore where the oil pump drive assembly mounts, you can see the slot that we can use a cordless drill and a flat tip screwdriver bit to rotate to circulate oil throughout the motor, so that when we start it, everything is well lubricated and nothing starts dry. Next, we need to make sure the engine is at top dead center. We do that by removing the first spark plug from the first hole and rotating the engine via the crankshaft bolt with our finger covering the spark plug hole. Once you feel compression, then rotate the front of the harmonic balancer until the top dead center notches line up. You'll actually hear a little rush of air come out of the cylinder as well. Yep, we're approaching top dead center. Make sure you always turn the harmonic balancer clockwise as you face it. You don't want to go against the direction of engine rotation, or the play in the timing chain will actually make you off in your timing just a little bit. A little more. Oh, I overshot it, which means we need to go all the way back around twice. Once the timing mark on the harmonic balancer lines up with the timing mark on the timing chain cover, you are at precisely top dead center. Now, take a small Phillips head screwdriver and insert it through the hole in the target wheel so that it lines up perfectly with the indexing hole in the base of the oil pump drive assembly. Don't forget to install a new gasket so that you don't get any water that intrudes into your oil. Now let's go ahead and reinstall our oil pump drive assembly. The cam sensor is going to end up about 4 o'clock, but since the gears that are turned by the camshaft are spirally cut, you're going to need to start before that on the clock. Start at about 2 o'clock or 3 o'clock, and it should rotate into place and sit flush with that cam sensor at right about 4 o'clock. Make sure that your target wheel is lined up with that screwdriver, still at top dead center. Notice that the base of the oil pump drive assembly is now sitting flush on the engine block. Now we'll install the bracket that secures the oil pump drive assembly, and with a little bit of Loctite on the 1/2-inch screw, let's insert that. And this screw is very hard to get to, so I'll probably have to use an open-ended box wrench in order to tighten this. I do not have a torque specification for it, but all it needs to be is snug. If you have trouble getting the oil pump drive assembly to sit flush on the engine block, you may need to rotate that slot, which is the oil pump drive itself, to where it lines up roughly from about 1 o'clock to about 7 o'clock. Now carefully remove your screwdriver that's kept the target wheel in place, and we'll install the cap to the oil pump drive assembly. It is not perfectly symmetrical, so if it seems like it's off, just rotate it 180 degrees and you should be fine. These are Torx 25 screws, and I like to use a little bit of Loctite when I install them just to be safe. And these just go snug, they don't need to be particularly tight. There's not a specified torque value. Now reinstall and torque that first spark plug. Now we can reinstall our coil rail, but before I do that, I like to get a little bit of silicone dielectric grease on the end of each spark plug. If you happen to do any deep water crossings, this will help make sure you get consistent spark and you don't get water between your spark plugs and the contact points on the coil rail. I like to use a little bit of anti-seize on the coil rail's 4 bolts. Just a little bit on the first 3/8 inch of threads or so. Tighten the 4 bolts on the coil rail to 192 inch-pounds. Well, I was hoping to install this hard line into the water pump. However, it does not clear the valve cover. So we're going to have to remove the water pump, scrape the gasket mating surfaces, install a new gasket, and reinstall the water pump with the hard line already installed and pointing straight back. The water pump is attached with 5 1/2-inch bolts. 4 of the bolts are the same length. The top one is longer. Then just pull to remove. Now let's remove that old gasket. And we'll have to scrape it with a razor blade to get it nice and clean. I won't bore you with the details, but you get the idea. Once you have that scraped clean, let's give it a quick vacuum. I had to be extra careful around the timing cover gasket because I didn't want to damage that. Make sure there's no coolant on this or else the gasket won't seal. That looks pretty good. I think we have both the engine block mating surface and the water pump mating surface perfectly clean. Let's put some thread sealant on the hard line, the heater line. Just enough to cover the threads. Then screw the heater line into the water pump. Make sure we have our orientation correct. Now we'll install our new gasket on the water pump. If you're using a Mopar water pump gasket like I am, you'll notice that there's a silicone ring around it, and that faces the water pump. I'm just going to put the top bolt in to hold that in place a little bit. Install your bolts. Remember, the long one is the top center bolt. These will all be tightened to 200 inch-pounds. We'll tighten those in your typical star pattern. Install your water pump pulley. You'll need to use a pulley holder in order to tighten the bolts on the water pump pulley. Let's install our coolant line that goes to the heater. Our other heater line on. That goes on top of the thermostat. Clip our hoses into the bracket, and that goes back on the valve cover bolt. Let's reattach our air conditioning lines now. We'll start by removing the tape that we had placed to seal the connections. Swing our lines around. Put our bracket over that front driver's side head bolt. It's a bit of a dance getting the air conditioning lines back in place. The bracket goes over that front driver's side head bolt. There's little gaskets on the bottom side of these AC connections here, so don't lose those. Go ahead and bolt down the bracket first. That's secured with a single 11/16 inch nut. Finish that up with an open-ended wrench. Doesn't need to go real tight, just snug. Next, let's snug down the bracket that holds these two lines in place. That's a 5/16 inch socket. Gently pull the two air conditioning lines down into place, making sure they fully seat. Then install the two 1/2 inch bolts that secure them. Let's swing our power steering pump back into place and secure that with the 3 bolts. Remember, to access these, you just put them through the holes in the pulley. Make sure you start tightening these by hand since we're threading steel fasteners into soft aluminum. Torque the 3 bolts securing the water pump to the intake manifold to 21 foot-pounds. Let's clip a couple sensors on. The green one goes up top onto the refrigerant line. And then our coolant temperature sensor goes onto the clip by the thermostat housing. Let's continue hooking up sensors, cables, and vacuum lines. Connect our brake master cylinder to the intake manifold. Connect the two vacuum lines that go underneath the wire rail there on the far driver's side of the intake manifold. This guy here. Let's secure the fuel line bracket to the intake manifold on the lower driver's side. That's a 10mm bolt. That just needs to be snug. Next, let's install the throttle cable to the intake manifold with two 10mm bolts. We'll torque both of these to 77 inch-pounds. Connect the throttle cable, snap it in place here, and the cable itself is attached right here, and feed this right through here. And the throttle cable is actually a little ball and socket joint, kind of like your hip. It just pops over that. Let's attach the various sensors to our throttle body. Let's connect the idle air control sensor. Don't forget to latch the little red latch there. Let's reinstall our throttle position sensor. It's secured by two T20 Torx bolts. And I went ahead and put thread locker on the threads of these because every time you adjust the throttle with your foot, you move the inside of this sensor and it's liable to work its way loose. These bolts are tightened to 60 inch-pounds. It is finally time to make the Jeep look like a Jeep again. Tuck the bottom of the grill underneath the sway bar cover. Now before we bolt the grill in, let's go ahead and reinsert our body mount. Secure the grill to the fenders with 3 bolts that go in the wheel wells. Three more just in front of those. We'll get all the bolts installed and tightened a little bit, but we'll make sure everything's lined up before we tighten everything down. Let's do the bolts on the passenger side. My version of snug is left-hand tight, since I'm right-handed. Let's snug these up on the backside now. Alright, the grill's on. Before I reinstall this center body mount here, I knocked as much rust off as I could with a wire brush, and then I'm going to give that a quick spritz of spray paint as well, just to try and help keep the rust at bay. Body mounts tend to hold a lot of water, and they tend to get a lot of rust. The other thing you're going to want to do is make sure you get plenty of anti-seize on body bolts. Next, let's connect our air conditioning lines to the condenser. Let's make sure these are clean. So wipe them with a clean, lint-free solvent-soaked rag. So this line right here goes on top. Tighten both of these to 105 inch-pounds using a 13mm socket. Let's feed our ambient air temperature sensor through the back side of the grill. Get that reattached. And fish the end underneath the little rubber seal that directs airflow to the front of the radiator and the condenser. And we'll reinsert this little fastener into that hole to hold it in place. The ambient temperature sensor is attached to the bottom of the radiator with a 10mm screw. The trick to getting this bolt in is to fold back the weather stripping behind it and use an extension and a wobbly. Now let's do the same for the sensor on the other side of the grill. There's no space to use a socket wrench on this, so you have to use a box wrench. Now we'll install the bezels that allow us to aim and secure our headlamps. These are secured with 3 5/16 inch nuts. There's no specified torque for these, we'll just get them gently snug. Let's reinstall our ground wires. Those are installed with 1/2 inch screws. Make sure you have the sharp side, the teeth side, pointed in. Next, let's install our headlamp. That's as simple as plugging in the 3 prongs on the back of it. Now using a T15 Torx driver, we'll install the 4 screws that secure the headlamp mounting bezel. Very easy to drop, try not to drop them. And those just get snugged down gently. Don't over tighten them. Now let's install the bright chrome trim surround. Oh, there goes my dog. And that is 3 T15 Torx screws as well. And those just barely go snug. Install the other side. Let's install the cooling fan and its viscous clutch onto the water pump pulley by screwing the nut onto those threads. Easiest if you just hold the fan and then move the pulley counterclockwise. Then we'll finish tightening it by securing the pulley with a pulley holder and just use a large crescent wrench. There we go. Doesn't have to be super tight, this will tighten itself as the fan spins. Now we'll install the radiator. It's attached with 6 10mm bolts. And they're not torqued very tight, only 72 inch-pounds. Well, shoot. Made it all this time and didn't lose a single part until now. I believe I left the clamp that attaches the lower radiator hose onto the radiator on the hose when I threw it away. So I just called the dealership where I work. They'll have one for me in the morning, but I'm gonna have to skip that for now and not forget to come back to it tomorrow. Tighten these to 72 inch-pounds. Let's install our upper radiator hose. This time I remembered to keep the hose clamps off the old hose. Next, we'll mount the alternator support bracket using 2 bolts that go into the head and 2 bolts to secure it to the block. Tighten these 14mm bolts to 41 foot-pounds. You may need to bump the alternator with the heel of your hand or even a rubber mallet to get it to seat on the bottom. I was still having trouble getting that to seat. If you just push up just a little bit with a pry bar, that should line everything up. There we go. So it goes right in. Tighten the alternator to the bracket via its 15mm bolts to 41 foot-pounds also. Now let's reconnect the ground for the alternator. Very important. It's a 13mm bolt and that just needs to be good and snug. Then on the back side of the alternator, don't forget to plug its electrical harness back in. That's pretty dirty. Let's clean that out first. Let's clip our wiring harness in here on the back side of the alternator bracket. That's a 1/2 inch. The smaller nut that goes on the stud is 7/16 inches. And this wiring holder just slides over the top. I just realized I forgot to install the fan shroud before I installed the fan, which you have to do. So, get a little more practice taking this fan off. Alright, now let's install the fan shroud, then the fan. This is what's left of my fan shroud, but it seems to work just fine, so I'm not going to worry about it. The fan shroud attaches with 4 7/16 inch bolts, which are torqued to 70 inch-pounds to the radiator assembly. Now we can put that fan back on. I'm going to hold the fan clutch nut in place while I spin the water pump pulley by hand. That should thread it on. And then pick one of the wider openings between the blades. Use a crescent wrench to hold the fan clutch nut and a pulley holder to hold the pulley. There we go. There's one last idler pulley we need to install before we can put that serpentine belt on. That goes just to the left of the thermostat. Using a 9/16 inch socket, tighten the idler pulley to the engine block to 35 foot-pounds. First, let's feed it around the water pump pulley. Get that around the crank pulley on the bottom. Much easier with an old belt. This new one's stiff. Go underneath to grab that. Well, that's about all that's left of my serpentine belt routing diagram after 17 years, but that's good enough. We'll make it work. And this goes underneath that idler pulley. And then back up over the alternator. Insert our 1/2-inch socket into our belt tensioner. Looks like we need to do one electrical ground to that driver's side rear head bolt stud. This certainly would have been easier to do before I put the wiring harness back on, but I'll bet we can do it. There we go. Alright. Now I should be able to get to that head stud. Just need to pop this back corner off. Let's slip our ground over the stud. And then our nut over the ground. What I ended up doing was popping this whole electrical rail off, which gives us enough clearance to snake an 11/16" socket on an extension back here to tighten this ground onto that back driver's side head stud. I'm going to use a deep well socket to get it fully seated. Alright, good and tight. Back in place. Let's put that 7/16" nut back in that corner. Tighten that up. Well, my dealership was unable to find the correct spring tension clamp, so I have one on order, but in the meantime, we'll use a screw type hose clamp. These are a bit prone to leaking because they can't expand as the hose gets hot and expands as well, but this will work for a few days. Last couple pieces, let's do the factory airbox. That airbox is attached to the inner side of the front fender with these little, about 1/8" thick metal screw washers. You may need to hold the bolt heads in the airbox with a 5/16" socket while you screw these on. Probably have to hold the that square nut underneath while you tighten the top. These don't need to go real tight, just tight enough they don't come off. Put a new air filter in the airbox. That old one was pretty dirty. Make sure that your throttle body's clean. And we'll install our air intake tube. Tighten this hose clamp with a 5/16" socket. Same with the throttle body side. Connect our crankcase ventilation tube. See that little split? That'll let extra air into the intake, which would cause the motor to run at an incorrect air to fuel ratio, because that air would be downstream of where the air that's coming into the motor is actually being monitored. So we have to find a new one of those before we can fire this up. Now I need to crawl underneath the Jeep and zip tie my block heater cord out of the way so that it isn't touching anything hot, seeing as I melted the last one. I actually forgot to fasten my front differential breather tube with this bolt right here. So let's remove that. I thought I had lost a bolt. Turns out I had not lost a bolt, which is pretty good. That means I didn't lose any bolts in this entire project. Our coolant overflow reservoir mounts to 2 slots in the fan shroud. Then put the vent tube to to the side of the radiator cap. Slide our constant tension hose clamp there and get a pair of pliers to get that fastened. You can almost do it with fingers, it's not real tight. Now let's reinstall our grill support braces. Let's do driver's side first. Just make sure the witness marks line up. These are secured with 2 1/2-inch bolts. Let's install our windshield washer fluid reservoir. I'm a skier and you can't go very far in the winter without one of these. That installs with 2 3/8-inch screws. Then we need to connect the little wiring harness that provides power to the windshield wiper squirter motors. And don't forget to connect the lines that distribute the washer fluid to the front and rear squirters. Let's install our manifold absolute pressure sensor. That is attached with 1 bolt, and then this little rubber nipple goes on this little metal tube here. I always try to get a little bit of anti-seize on any of the bolts that attach the sensor to the throttle body, since they're subject to some vibration. The map sensor is attached to the throttle body with a single Torx T25 screw. Be sure to start these by hand, since you're threading steel into aluminum. This map sensor screw does not take a lot of torque. You can literally get it finger tight. We'll call it 2 hands finger tight. Has a little rubber O-ring, a little rubber bushing, then you don't want to squish that too much, or else you're liable to split it. Let's reattach our front drive shaft. This is done using a 5/16-inch socket. If you ever have a wheel off while you're trying to install a front drive shaft, you're going to notice that the drive shaft wants to spin. You can just wedge a pry bar between the lug studs on one of your wheels, and that'll keep everything from turning. Let's fill that up. I think this holds a gallon. I don't think I've ever had it totally empty before though. Let's find out. Yep, 1 gallon capacity. Let's fill our cooling system now, both the radiator and the overflow reservoir. We'll start by reusing what old coolant that we can. Let's put those battery cables back on. I'll put my winch on later once I know that the motor's working. 10mm wrench on the battery connections themselves. Make sure those are tight. Now all we really have left to do is to check the oil, prime the oil pump, and turn the key. Want to make sure, of course, that your oil and coolant are full before you actually do start the motor. Make sure you don't have any wires touching anything that's going to get hot, and you're probably going to want an assistant for this as well. Oil is full. In order to prime the oil pump and circulate oil throughout the engine so that we don't have any metal-on-metal contact when we first go to start it, we're going to remove the cap and the oil pump drive assembly and insert a cordless screwdriver with a long bit down and just spin the gear itself that drives the oil pump. When we installed this, the motor was at top dead center, and since we haven't moved anything, the motor should still be at top dead center. But if you're not absolutely certain of that, then I would again put it at top dead center. In order to make sure that the engine stays at top dead center, as does the oil pump drive assembly and its relationship to the engine, I'm going to insert a 5mm Allen key into the hole in the target wheel. That should slide all the way through the bottom of the housing in the oil pump drive assembly. With a 1/2-inch open-ended box wrench, we'll remove the nut that secures the hold down clamp. Now we'll pull the oil pump drive assembly out. It'll rotate as you remove it. Put a clean rag underneath it, keep it clean. And just set it aside, kind of by the motor mount. Between the motor mount and the fender works pretty well. Now we'll insert the long bit of our cordless screwdriver in until it fits in the slot in the oil pump drive assembly. When you stop, you should be able to hear oil dripping in the crankcase. You need to rotate that slot inside of the screwdriver so it lines up first. Now we'll reinstall the oil pump drive assembly. Make sure the base of the assembly sits flush with where it meets the block of the motor. And it rotates clockwise as you install it. There we go. Once you have the hold down clamp reinstalled, go ahead and remove the Allen key from the target wheel. Make sure it doesn't move. Then reinstall the cap. Let's close that hood so I can clear the garage door on the way out. So you're going to need a partner for this. Line's going to help us out. And what we're going to do is we're going to turn the key to the on position 3 or 4 times to prime the fuel system. That'll give us full pressure because we want the engine to start right away. And then as soon as the engine fires, hopefully it starts and catches, you're going to keep the engine RPMs about 2,000, 2,200 or so for about 20 minutes straight. You can let it fluctuate a little, but it needs to stay at higher RPMs or middle RPMs so that it has full oil pressure and all of our new parts stay lubricated. Go ahead. Turn it off. Turn it back on. Do that 2 more times. That should give us full fuel pressure to all of our fuel injectors. One more time. Excellent. Thank you. So I'm just going to look over everything one more time, just make sure everything's good, and then we'll fire her up. I think everything's good. Here we go. After our 20 minutes of cam and lifter break-in, we're going to want to change the oil again. And we're going to use break-in oil for this oil change as well. And put 100 or 200 miles on it, and then we can switch to whatever oil we normally run. That's a good sign. It's not dark. And I don't see any metal in it. So it looks like the parts probably made it up just fine. Let's put a new oil filter on. Make sure to get that seal wet with oil. Once you're done with your initial break-in procedure, change your oil and then go for a drive. Next 100 or 200 miles, we're going to keep our RPMs between about 2,000 and 3,500. Want to vary them as best you can. We're trying to keep real high oil pressure without overspeeding the engine just yet until all the surfaces that are going to mate together have worn a little bit smoother. We don't want to idle very much either, so we're going to try and avoid that. Shifting gears about 3,500 RPMs. Boy, it's nice to be driving my Jeep again. It's been a while. After 200 miles of this, I'm going to change the oil again and put in my regular oil, which is Mobil 1 high mileage 10W30, and then she's all done. Just going to drive her for another couple 100,000 miles. I hope this was helpful for everybody. If it was, please like and subscribe. See you guys on the trails.